Wisconsin so far this year has interviewed more than 150 candidates for the Wisconsin State Assembly and Senate. When we go to rural areas, we ask them to list the concerns of the rural areas. Invariably, one of those issues is broadband. So we've asked 3 people and officials familiar with the broadband issue to talk about that. To my left is State Senator Dale Schultz. He's a Republican from the 17th District. Andy Lewis is Professor of Community and Economic Development, UW Extension, and Stan Gruszynski is a State Director, USDA Office of Rural Development. For the record, Wisconsin asked a member of the Walker administration to join the panel and was not able to get in anyone. So, gentlemen, thanks very much. A very important issue.
It certainly is.
Dale, and I want to ask this question. I looked it up. In 2009, I interviewed you and former Senator Jim Holprin from Eagle River on the state of rural broadband. So let me begin with this opening question. Major progress made since 2009? Talk about what you've seen, sir.
There's no question that we have made major progress. I would say, first of all, the awareness of the issue is much greater among the public, among the industry, and I give Senator Jauch and Senator Holprin a great deal of credit for working with me in helping raise that awareness. We have more data than we had back then, and it puts us in a better situation to take positive action in the future. We have seen some increase in terms of the number of people that we're providing service to, some increase in speed. But I have to tell you, I remain frustrated because we're not aiming at a stationary target. The speeds demanded by the public and are required by the public in the use of big data now are growing very fast, and we're not keeping up.
So progress, but glass still half empty, Senator?
I would say so.
Okay, any PSs on that, Andy or Stan?
Well, it's a moving target. I agree with what Dale has said, and you know, as much as the federal government in this case tries to invest in these areas, the changing technology requires updates and more investments. So even though we're attempting to support the infrastructure in rural Wisconsin, that's constantly changing as well, so it's hard to keep up, and it makes it quite a challenge.
Andy?
Yeah, I think the problem is that the problem's never going to be completely solved. It is going to be growing demand for bandwidth, and we've actually had a substantial increase in the number of lines that are better than dial-up, but it hasn't kept up, as Senator Schultz has said, with consumer demand and business demand, that there's this appetite out there for greater bandwidth, and we've had a very difficult time keeping up with that.
Well, so we've had some progress, but the technology and the demands and the cost, are these the major impediments to going the next mile on this issue?
I think that pretty well sums it up. I mean, there's a reality here that doesn't go away. Providing service costs money, and the distance per mile of providing that service gets harder when you have fewer and fewer subscribers. And the companies involved in this are for-profit ventures by and large. They have to be aware of the bottom line. They have to be able to compete with one another. I think the help from the federal government has been extremely helpful. But the reality is we need to do much, much more. And if Wisconsin, all of Wisconsin, is going to prosper in the future, then we have to find a way to include all of our people.
Well, actually, Steve, when you mentioned 2009, that's when I came on board as state director. Since that time, through the Rural Utility Services, we've invested about $300 million in broadband, either through support or expansion or technology or whatever. But
is that just in Wisconsin?
That's just in Wisconsin,
okay,
yes.
Thank you.
But the problem is that that's not enough money. And if you're really going to reach those rural communities where the expenses are higher, as Senator Schultz pointed out, then you've got to make those sorts of investments. And the federal government, at least the Congress at this time, doesn't seem as willing to make those sort of investments as they once did. You know, we had rural electrification a number of decades back, same issues. But the federal government said, look, in order to create a more level playing field, create opportunity, make sure that rural communities could produce and sustain themselves, we're going to invest in rural electrification, later rural telephone, and good farm-to-market road system. Well, so we need those infrastructure investments.
So there's been a $300 million investment over what period of years, Stan?
Since 2009.
Has it been just in the broadband issue or others?
No, I'm just talking about what rural development does with its appropriations through the Rural Utilities Services in Wisconsin through the Department of Agriculture, USDA.
But Andy, I think as we discussed getting ready for the show, you use the B word, that this is a $1 billion issue?
Yeah, it's probably a multi-billion-dollar issue for the state of Wisconsin, and those are scary numbers. But I think one of the ways we need to look at that is it's not necessarily it's a cost, it's an investment that actually pays big dividends on the business side. And so it's one of those investments that could pay off in the long run in terms of turning around our economy. But yeah, let's be clear, it's a multi-billion-dollar problem. But in addition to just the infrastructure and the cost, there's a third issue I would add, and that's digital literacy. We have a fair number of households that really don't see the need for broadband, that, as Senator Schultz has said, are beginning to understand that and are beginning to become paid subscribers. So we have some areas that have access, but we have low subscribership numbers, and we're seeing some change in that. And I think we actually have one graphic, the first graphic, that might speak to some of these points that the investments are making a difference and that we're making some progress. This first graph that we should be seeing on screen, I think the encouraging thing here is if you look at that Wisconsin line, there's been a tremendous increase between 2012 and 2013, and that's the most recent data, in the percentage of high-speed lines that are at least at 3 megabits per second download, 1 megabit per second upload. That's encouraging, but at the end of the day, a little over half of those lines are at a speed that approximates what the federal government considers to be a minimum broadband connection for residential. So we have a long ways to go. And that standard is very old. And in fact, the National Broadband Plan is scheduled to be updated this year. And most of the experts are saying that that standard will probably go up to something in the neighborhood of 10 megabits per second download, 3 megabits per second upload. So we're making great strides. Some of that is likely due to the public investments, the grants, the ARA funding, the rural development funding. The second slide I think that we want to look at gets at this consumer demand issue, and these are the consumers that are calling Senator Schultz and saying we aren't getting the connectivity that we need. This visual shows the results of the Public Service Commission Consumer Broadband Survey, and of the consumers that responded to that, actually a majority are dissatisfied with the service they have. The good news is that only 13% were responding by saying they had no connection, but the majority aren't getting the connectivity that they need.
But Andy, was this a statewide survey or rural area?
No, it was a statewide survey, and I need to point out that you'd have to be motivated to respond to the survey, so it probably understates the people that are satisfied with their service, because if you're satisfied you probably wouldn't respond. The people who were motivated to respond were rural, so it very much has a rural bias to it.
But this program is about rural broadband.
Right.
So I would argue that when you throw rural in with everyone else,
absolutely,
it tends to understate the size of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
So while I understand the bias that you see there because of motivation, I certainly agree with that. I also think this graph doesn't really tell the story in the rural area. No connection probably is higher.
Well, he said that this graph reflects the people calling your office?
No.
Dale?
Well, they are the consumers that are not satisfied that want to talk to somebody.
And they've been calling your office for years.
That's true, but this survey is for all of Wisconsin, not just rural areas.
Rural and urban.
One point I would make in all of this, and that is just rural poverty. Some people simply can't afford to have the service, and that's something that has to be addressed. This is all very expensive. It's expensive for companies, for co-ops, for small telephone companies. It's a big bet that they place in a time when technology is changing rapidly. So they're somewhat limited. There is a role for the state and federal government to sort of help level the playing field if we really want Wisconsin to prosper in its entirety. And I would suggest that we all do, and that means we need to do substantially more in rural areas.
Let me step back and ask and follow up what you just said, Dale, this way. What do rural communities lose by not having broadband? Stan, your thoughts?
Business development, new startups, expansion of business, more state-of-the-art healthcare and library systems. All of those things are very closely connected to broadband service, telecommunications, data, transfer of data, those sorts of things. So a community that is seen by someone coming in from the outside, or even those on the inside that want to expand, as not being aware of the importance of high-tech communications, gets passed by to those communities that do see the advantage of it. And unfortunately, as these gentlemen have been pointing out, most of that is around the urban areas because there's more access. So if you're a rural community in northern Wisconsin where the next community the same size as you is 50 miles away, you're on a pretty hard path to advancing yourself economically without some support for investment in rural broadband.
Maybe this is too simplistic a question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is it fair, what percentage of rural Wisconsin has access to broadband with some type of speed? Is that too simplistic, Andy?
Well, it is. That's the answer, is that it's not about getting the broadband. It's about getting people the connectivity that they need. And a farm is going to need different bandwidth than an average residential customer or an average manufacturing client might need. And so the standard, or what actually is broadband, I think a better definition of that would be it's the connection you need to run the applications that you need to run without limitation.
Capacity.
It's going to be different for every user. But I think you've hit it on the head. It's about quality of life. It's about being connected to the global marketplace. If you don't have that kind of connectivity, you're not going to be able to compete in the global marketplace. And I used to say, you know, my kids would never locate in a community that didn't have adequate broadband. I quit saying that because I wouldn't live in a community that didn't have adequate broadband connectivity. There's too many good choices out there, communities that actually have adequate broadband.
And what surprises me, if I could just add to that, Steve, to what Andy is saying, is that what surprises me is the number of people that we've been in contact with in our agency who are considering expansion or business development or otherwise, or creating a small business in a rural community, who say, well, I wouldn't do it here because they just don't have the capacity in terms of broadband capabilities. I'm looking for this. And so they might be coming to us for a business development loan, but not to develop that business in the very community they're coming from, but rather a community that they feel gives them more options in terms of connectivity and capacity and those sorts of things.
To further complicate this, you know, you really need to talk about wired versus wireless connections, because, you know, there's a different place for each of them. And, you know, but what they share in common is there's just more and more demand. You know, we talk about the Internet of Things and are fascinated, but how many of us actually sit down and say, how are we going to handle all this transfer of data? And can we afford not to be a part of that? I mean, it's public safety, sensors and bridges. It's smart homes that are safer and that makes better use of scarce resources for police and fire protection and the like. It's not just businesses, but businesses are probably the key.
Andy,
I'm just thinking that next graphic might actually be helpful to support some of the points that were made. That,
go ahead. Boy, this is complicated. Walk us through.
You've got three maps on this. The good news is that we've got a lot better data today than we had 10 years ago.
Okay.
And so this is data from the Public Service Commission that comes from the FCC.
And which map are you going to start with, sir?
Let's look at the fiber to the premise coverage. You know, that's what most people would call the next generation service. That's what's delivering the fastest speeds in this country. So you're talking about 1 to 10 gigabit connectivity, which is about 100 times faster than what most of our consumers in Wisconsin are getting. And you can see relatively limited coverage, but it's encouraging. There are places like northern Wisconsin where the Novato Cooperative has invested heavily in fiber in an area of the state where you wouldn't expect to see that kind of coverage.
That's
you see
kind of Douglas and Bayfield County area?
And then in southwest Wisconsin, near Senator Schultz's area, the Vernon County Telephone Cooperative has made quite a few investments in fiber. So that's what most people are reading about in the papers. But then if you look at these next two maps...
Well, I want to stop you.
Okay.
So is it encouraging? You're talking here about the fiber to premise. Is this encouraging or discouraging?
I think it's very encouraging.
Encouraging.
It's courageous is what it is.
Yeah.
These people have made huge investments without knowing whether they're going to pay off, without knowing clearly what the future is going to hold. And, you know, even if it's a cooperative, it's still a business.
Yeah.
And the directors, you know, have to sit there and really have their commitment tested to serving their friends and neighbors, and I'm proud of the fact that we have a number of those companies in our area that have done that. But not everybody is that courageous or can be that courageous, and we're going to have to do a lot more.
It really takes care of the issue of guessing what the consumers and businesses are going to need, because it's delivering the speeds that they're going to need for the foreseeable future, for the next 5 to 10 years. It can deliver those kinds of speeds, and I think that's why you're starting to see some of these courageous investments, is they don't have to constantly be making these minor upgrades in their system. They're going to actually the next generation of how we're going to be delivering internet.
I'm going to elaborate on courageous just a little bit. So this is encouraging because organizations, for-profit, nonprofit, etc., have taken a risk to lay down fiber in these areas, correct?
Exactly.
But it's still, from my naive, it's not much of the state.
It's not.
Okay, but it's still far ahead.
If you had looked at this map a few years ago, it would have been white.
Thank you for putting in perspective.
Yeah.
And another thing, Steve, is we're getting beyond the mental barrier, in my opinion. 10 years ago, communities would say, we don't need that here. We'll be just fine without it. Now there's the realization that to stay in step with the worldwide markets and everything that goes with telecommunications, they need to think about this, and they need to take the risks that Dale is talking about and begin to step out a little bit. And that really helps our agency, because we cannot single-handedly fund these initiatives, but we can work in conjunction with the telecoms and the cooperatives and others to help support the technology and make it affordable and take some of the risk that they're looking at when they make these investments.
And that's a very good point. I just want to elaborate on public-private partnerships, the efforts of local community economic developers engaging with service providers are all critically important, and that's really where Stan's agency shines the best, because it has a lot of experience getting people to do that, work together to get things done, and that's encouraging. But again, we know just how big a problem this is, or how big a challenge it is, and we need to do a lot more.
Okay, Andy, do you want to move on to the middle map?
Yeah, this might be appropriate time too, just to put in a plug for the broadband expansion grant program that the legislature
I was
created.
Ask you about
that it's I would argue it's woefully underfunded. It's $500,000, and we just got done talking about $1 billion.
Is that for biennium or per year?
Per year.
Per year.
But what the great part about that program is it's going to fund public-private partnerships, and it's going to provide some models that could be replicated in other parts of the state that likely wouldn't even need grant funding. So it's going to fund some really good models, I think, in Wisconsin.
That's when I see the press releases from the PSC, that's a competition, isn't it?
It's a competitive grant program.
It's a competitive grant. Who decides who gets them?
It's a team of reviewers within the Public Service Commission. So they've had the first round of grants announced, and the next deadline, I believe, is October for the second round. And
but it's funded only at $500,000 per year
total, for the year.
$4 million over for 2 bienniums.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Excuse me, Andy.
So, I think actually the success rate of applications was pretty high in that first round. We don't know what it'll be for the second round, but it's something to look at for communities that are looking at public-private partnerships.
But it's a beginning.
Absolutely.
We're developing models, and that's, I would say, a long way from having universal service that provides people the service they need.
And if you were coming back to the Senate, what funding level would you push for that program the next biennium, Dale?
You know, we collect $117 million for sales tax on internet service connections. That goes to fund a lot of worthwhile things. I'm not going to argue with that, but if we don't take care of the basic infrastructure, that's the number one challenge. So we have to find more money, and it seems to me that legislators from rural areas are going to have to fight much, much harder to get their colleagues to support an appropriate level of funding, particularly in the rural areas. And the problem with that is rural legislators are a minority in both caucuses, and in a world where it's driven by base politics, where the majority rules, rural areas are always left out. So what we need is a bipartisan coalition that is going to grow in strength. part of the secret of our success in recent years has been the fact that we have had a bipartisan coalition. I mentioned Senator Jauch and Senator Holprin stood side by side with me, and we fought the good fight. But as time goes on, money becomes more important, the world gets more polarized, it really creates a great peril for rural areas. So that would be my plea, that legislators put the party second for a while and do what's right for all their constituents.
This is a new issue that wasn't around when you were in the Assembly, right?
It was a little more congenial. But I don't know that I contributed to the congeniality.
But in terms of broadband, that wasn't on the...
No, that wasn't on the table. But something that I want to mention that Senator Schultz brought up that I think you'll find helpful is that the federal government, specifically the Department of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, recognizes this problem. In other words, it's a big investment. But he's not simply looking to the Congress for that funding. He's just put together a business innovation fund where you have private sector capital investors pooling their monies, their dollars, to take higher risks in areas where they think it'll pay off regionally. So that means people who want to invest in broadband in rural parts of the United States or rural Wisconsin may be able to look to that fund to find additional capital investment, private sector dollars to support the federal dollars and the local dollars to put this sort of infrastructure in place.
Would that be federal dollars and private partnership and some local government /and/or state money?
All of those things,
All of
yes,
those things.
absolutely.
Okay.
And I really think that that's the way of the future, and I would guess, Dale, you probably think so as well.
Yep, I do.
Okay. Andy, we kind of got distracted. Do you want to walk us through the middle chart there?
So just quickly, these are the data, again, from the Public Service Commission, and they get that from the FCC, and they get that from the providers. The second map shows the average download speeds in Wisconsin that are provided by wireline, and by that I mean a physical wire coming into the house. It could be coaxial cable, copper, or fiber. And you can start to see the holes in that map, and particularly in the rural areas of Wisconsin. So we have some holes in coverage. The other thing, again, to increase anxiety maybe, is just this idea that the new standard for residential broadband is likely to be at 10 megabits per second. There's not a lot of red on that map. So what's going to happen is even an increasing number of households don't have access to what was now considered broadband. The last map shows wireless, and somebody could look at that wireless map and say, well, what's the problem? We have really wide coverage in Wisconsin for mobile broadband, and that's largely true. But these maps overstate coverage. That's one of the issues. Any consumer with a cell phone knows where the dead spots are, and the map isn't quite as colorful as what we're looking at. Dale mentioned cost. Cost is a huge issue with mobile broadband. If you're relying on mobile for data, the caps that are there and the pay-as-you-go system, you could literally be spending hundreds of dollars a month if you were relying on a mobile connection for your broadband. And again, it's speed. So the red areas there are the 25 megabits per second or more. You can see where those are located, largely urban areas. And I'll be honest and say I'm bothered when I hear that when people say, well, mobile is going to be the answer to rural Wisconsin, because they need both. And the schools, the libraries, the big data users are still going to need fiber. And by the way, it's fiber that's going to those towers to deliver the mobile. So there are great promises in technological advances in both wireless and wired, and the good news is that's going to get better for both wired and wireless. But I don't think we should say that rural should have to rely strictly on mobile broadband to get their broadband connectivity. It's not going to get them the bandwidth that they need for some of the big users.
Is the gap between the rural broadband haves and have-nots closing or getting wider, gentlemen?
I don't think it's getting wider, but I think the anxiety is growing in terms of those communities that do not have it, how they're going to get it, how do they put these sorts of things together, where can they get support, where can they even get the technical know-how to know where to ask. It's interesting to me because we just had finished another set of hearings with the public about business development in rural communities, and there again the number one issue was broadband. We need better broadband. Yet when you pursued it to see particularly what they needed. They just needed broadband, which suggests to me that we've got a whole lot more to do in terms of helping the public understand the capacities, how they reach those capacities, the difference between whatever it was, the wireless and fiber, and those sorts of issues, because in the final analysis, communities have to come together to really get this job done. Rural communities have to act in unison.
I would come back to what Andy said earlier in the program about the connectivity you need. And I think that's very important, because when we're talking about the gap, that's really what we're talking about, and that's hard to talk about. But think about this. In a world where we're soon going to wear clothing with embedded sensors that is going to be vital to taking data about our health and transferring it to somebody. Okay. I mentioned sensors in bridges and home security. You're going to see the same thing in automobiles that move about. Agriculture. I'm involved in farming. Smart farming is just around the corner on our farming operation. We're beginning to talk about that and thinking about.
Are you farming with GPS now, Dan?
No, okay. But we're well aware that that's coming, and even if you're not farming where everything is done through GPS, you're using GPS and collecting cards out of machines and crunching it, and you can just see the movement forward. The world has changed dramatically. It's going to continue to change. In order to participate in a bright future, you've got to have that basic connectivity. So it depends on the pace of change.
Are there some very rich rural areas where they're plugging into the broadband on their own and just absorbing the costs, just saying, I need this? Is that going on?
I don't think it's a question of very rich. It's the appetite for risk and the willingness of people to take those risks. Okay. I mean, I look at the Lemonware Telephone Cooperative. Yeah. I mean, what those guys have done is absolutely amazing, and they're not the only ones. I'll just use them for an example. That's not a wealthy area at all, but they've recognized its importance. And, they have a long history in the cooperative movement, and they understand what Stan was talking about, rural electrification, and they know the size of the risk that their forefathers took to provide electricity. And in some areas, that ethic or that knowledge is sort of faded. So it's not about money so much in the community than it is about just the leadership and the awareness of the importance of doing something.
Well, you said the term courage and risk. P.S. on that
I was going to say Reedsburg might be one of the exceptions, where Reedsburg has a municipally provided fiber network. They provide gig service to all of their businesses and residents. And when I showed you the fiber to the premise map, I think, again, one of the surprising and encouraging things is a lot of those investments are being made, for example, in Vernon County, in the heart of the Driftless region, tough terrain, lower incomes, population not very high. You wouldn't expect to see those kinds of investments. It's being driven by the members of those cooperatives that recognize they need that connectivity. And I think in terms of how we're doing, the final chapter hasn't been written, and I think the litmus test ought to be, how well are we doing serving farms? Farms are our most remote business, and based on the last ag census, there's about a third of the farms that say that they don't have an internet connection either in their house or even at the library, going somewhere to have a connection. So it's critical to agriculture, and so that's what we need to be thinking about. That's what we need to be thinking about in order to say the job's done, that we're actually serving those farms with an adequate connection, and we're a long ways away from that.
Well, it intrigues me. Wisconsin has also done a lot of work on rural schools, and I was struck by one superintendent's comment. We can get broadband into our high school and even middle school, but when the students go home, back in some of those valleys, they don't have the ability to access it and to grow academically based on the lesson plans that we've just established. That's still stuck with me. And another thing Kevin Kennedy of the Government Accountability Board said, when we're providing updated information to local elections clerks, he said, Steve, some of them don't have broadband. Yeah. So
I'm familiar with examples of both of those with local election officials as well as schools. And Andy's entirely right. It doesn't do the community a lot of good if the school has service, but the families don't.
okay.
It's interesting because as part of the extension grant-funded fiber project up in the Chippewa Valley, they're doing just that through the CISA district, is they're providing that wireless connection to the students so that when they do get home, they have a connection. But it's actually a lot worse than that, and we don't have time for that today. But when you look at the subsidized circuits that we provide to the school districts, we only provide one subsidized circuit per district, which means that you have some facilities that are woefully underserved. And then those kids in the underserved schools end up in the same high school at some point in time, and they're at a competitive disadvantage. It's an equity issue, and we simply have to figure that out. We need to figure out how to get our schools and libraries the connectivity they need.
And remember, we put caps on our schools in terms of spending, so they can't even help themselves, that they're in a poor position to make up the difference.
Right. In fact, several of our distant learning loans and grants have gone to the CISAs, and those CISAs covering the most rural and sparsely populated areas of the state, just for the reasons that have been talked about here. But it's not enough. I think we've invested about $600,000 in CISAs to upgrade telecommunications, to assist schools and to ensure that these kids have some kind of access. But we're not serving all that need to be served, and the federal government can't do it alone unless Congress is willing to step forward and identify that as a priority.
Okay.
Let me just talk about something that occurs to me. I think that the need for transparency and how we're doing is important, and I'm really intrigued by what Andy said about how we're doing with farms, because that is the basis of an economy in a rural area. I think it's very, very important that we not kid ourselves in the future. We're measuring how school teachers teach now. We're asking for metrics from workers in our factories. I think it's high time for us to have a stated set of goals for broadband in this state, and that we challenge ourselves not for just the next election, but 4, 5 years out, because I think that's the kind of leadership that people of this state are looking for, that we're geared for success in the long haul.
Well, we're almost out of time, and Dale, thanks for the perfect segue, because my proposed ending is for each of you to kind of look forward to the major policy decisions that will be confronting Congress, our state leaders, and those issues, and how you think they're going to present themselves, and how you think they should be resolved. And you just did a great job, Dale, to set broadband goals 3-5 years out.
Absolutely.
Any other PSs?
Well, I would urge the listeners during this election season, I don't care whether you're a Republican or Democrat, but to confront the people who want to hold public office. What are your plans? Are you willing to work together with members of the opposite political party so we can reach the goals we all need or know we need to reach? And I think that's critically important, and it will be the people ultimately in this state who make the difference as to whether the fighting stops and the progress begins, or whether we're going to be permanently mired in just this internecine warfare in Madison.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to look forward out the major policy issues that present themselves, sir?
Well, I think Senator Schultz touched on one of them. We have the Department of Revenue estimate that the sales tax on internet access is about $117 million. That means we're spending over $2 billion in internet access, and we're one of 7 states that tax that service. It might make sense from a public policy standpoint to reserve a percentage of that. I don't have the magic number for expansion of broadband. And in comparing our program to Minnesota budgeted $20 million. And again, it's a $1 billion problem. I think number 2, I'm very concerned about the equity issue in our schools and libraries, and we simply need to figure out how to get that done. And there's good evidence that we're spending about 10 times more than the national average to get our schools and libraries the broadband that they need.
The state of Wisconsin is?
The state of Wisconsin. I'd argue one of the policy options there might be to have those companies compete for the service as opposed to setting the price collectively. That's a whole other conversation.
Okay.
But we spend too much on internet, and I don't know of anybody that would disagree that almost every one of our schools need a gigabit connectivity. That's the federal standard. And it's because of the number of devices as much as it is about the applications and their demand. It's the multiple devices that's driving the need for more bandwidth.
Okay. Stan, you want to look ahead?
Well, Steve, it's not just broadband, it's rural infrastructure in general that I'm somewhat concerned about. If you take a look at the most recent census, 16% of the total population is considered rural, 84% urban. Now, if you consider that the House of Representatives breaks out sort of the same way, and you think in terms of raw political clout, if rural communities are going to have the infrastructure that they need, and they produce the food and the fiber and the wherewithal for the rest of the nation, then we've got to begin to set the partisanship aside and set the demographics aside and look at the long-term interest not only of the state but the nation. In other words, if we invest in rural infrastructure, and that includes broadband and those sorts of telecommunications investments, does that just benefit rural communities, or does it benefit urban communities as well, creating opportunities? So I think the public has to start looking beyond its selfish interest and look more in terms of the broader interests of the nation as a whole, and states like Wisconsin where rural is so important, but they simply don't have the political clout that they need to direct those dollars, those public dollars at least.
Fewer ideologues, more problem solvers.
Well,
Exactly.
Here
we are.
You just reminded me too, is we need to do a better job of coordinating that infrastructure development. That almost all of the fiber in this state resides in road rights of way. So when we're digging up roads, that's when we should be putting the conduit in the ground. That's when we should be putting the fiber in the ground. It would reduce costs substantially. So coordinating some of those infrastructure improvements, I think, is critical too, and something we need to spend some time thinking about.
You're absolutely right, Andy.
Well, that's great. It's been a wonderful discussion that underscores how important not only broadband but other issues are to rural Wisconsin.
Absolutely.
I want to thank Senator Dale Schultz, Professor Andy Lewis, Stan Gruszynski, State Director of the USDA Office of Rural Development. Gentlemen, thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you to Wisconsin Eye for having us.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Dale.
Absolutely.